It's Create Day, my friends. Let's make some French country risers using IOD's summer release, molds, stamps, and paint inlay. Welcome to my channel. Let's get started. I'll be using this wood plaque that I picked up at the thrift store. And then I am also using this little box sign that I got from my daughter. And then this is another thrift store find. It has a blemish on it, but that's okay. That's the one I'm starting with. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the hanger on the back and the stickers. I just go ahead and rip off as much of that paper that's on there as I can, and then I'm going to fill the holes where the hanger was with some Durham's water putty, and then I'll come back and remove the rest of that paper that's on there. So I just mix up a little bit of this. You just do a little bit of the powder with some water and mix it together, and then I'm just dabbing it in the holes with my finger. Once it's dry, I can come back and sand that smooth. I use my water mister to just dampen the remaining paper, and that loosened it up enough to where I could just come in with a little scraper, and I was able to get most of it off. Then I could lightly sand over that when I sand down the Durham's water putty. I'm using white gesso to give this a good base coat over the entire box. I don't need coverage with this. The wording and everything will still show through, but I'm going to be painting this with chalk paint, so I just wanted kind of like a primer coat over the whole thing. The next step is to make some castings with Dainty Flourishes mold from IOD. I dust the mold first with some cornstarch, and now I'm just going to work my DAS air dry clay into the pieces that I've chosen. I end up making 4 of these to go on my little riser, and I found that it's helpful to have a scraper to get off the excess off the back of the casting. Now for these little triangular shaped ones, I'm doing 2 on each corner, so I will need a total of 8. I'm going to attach all of these with Gorilla Wood Glue, and I'm doing this before my clay is dry. Now with this piece, it broke, so I'm gluing the 2 pieces separately. The idea was to have the bigger part on the side and just wrap that little top piece around. But this one broke, so I just went ahead and did them separately. And I have better luck with the other ones. They held in place and wrapped around the way I wanted them to. But this one turned out fine. I had to kind of smooth out that little gap where the break was. Now for the corner pieces, I'm going to line them up as close as I can to the top and to that corner. So now I'm just going to work my way around this little box, putting all my castings on there. And here you can see where I'm matching up those 2 corner pieces, just butting the edges together as close as I can. So now I have all the castings on there, and it's time to go ahead and go right in with my white chalk paint. I'm using Cottage White, and I'm going to mix in a little bit of a color called Castle to make it just more of an off-white. I didn't want the really bright white, so I just keep mixing until I get the shade that I want, and I know that I have enough paint to cover my piece. I'm going to start with this kind of rounded tip brush and then a small pointy brush to get into those little details on the castings. It's perfectly fine to paint these when they're still wet, You just want to be gentle with your paintbrush and not press too hard to distort the casting. Here's how it's looking so far, and I did do a second coat. When the first coat was dry, I went in and did the inside and sides of the box. Now these little wood spindles that I'm using for the feet, I picked up off of Amazon, and they are great because they are flat on the top and on the bottom. So they work great for this. And I will leave a link for them in my description box, as well as all of the other products that I'm using that I am able to link. So I'm just giving these a coat of that same chalk paint that I mixed up. Next up is some transfers from the Iron Orchid Designs Brocante book. I wanted to use some text on the top of my riser, so I'm just cutting out the ones I want, and then I will arrange them and put them on. So now that I know where I want them to go, I'm just going to remove that backing, and using my little transfer tool, I'm just burnishing these on there. I had 4 of these really small ones that I thought would look cute on the front and the back of the box. I decided to try the super glue, Gorilla super glue gel to attach the feet. I wanted a quick hold so I could move on with my project. And it did work for a time, but they ended up coming off, so I had to use something else. Now I'm going to use Dixie Belle's Grunge Glaze to add some age to this. I've got a fine tip brush that I'm going to just work this down into all of the details. You can seal your project first if you're afraid of getting too much of this on there and not being able to wipe it back enough. But my experience with this particular one and the level of grunge that I want is it works out just fine for me to put it on directly onto the chalk paint without it being sealed. And I just use the baby wipe to wipe back the excess. I go ahead and add this to the grooves in the spindles and the grooves on the top of the box. Now I'm going to use a clear wax to go over the entire piece so I can prep this for some dark wax and have a much better ability to wipe back the darker wax. I brush it on and then use a nice soft rag to wipe off the excess. This clear wax will also seal the project for the areas that I'm not doing the dark wax. It gives it the finished end result that I would want anyway. So that's why I'm just doing the entire piece with that. Now I'm going to use Jolie's finishing wax in the color black to get down into all those details to add some age. It was during this process that things went awry with the little spindle legs. Right there, there's number 1 casualty. And then there were others, but I fixed that after I'm done with this process. So after I brush that wax on, I just go ahead and wipe back the excess. And if you're not getting enough of it off, you can always go back in with your clear wax to help clean that up a little bit more. Once I was done with this step, I went ahead and re-glued the legs on with some E6000, and that did the trick. So next we're taking some antique gold rub and buff to just add to the highlights of all of these molds and the little spindle legs. So now I'm going to use my short stubby brush that I use with my rub and buff and apply that to those little spindles, and then also to the bottom edge and top edge of the riser tray. And with that, this little project is done, and here's how it turned out. For this next one, I lightly sanded it with some fine grit sandpaper, and then I'm going to give this a good couple of coats of my black chalk paint. I always spritz my brushes with some water before I use the chalk paint. I feel like it just helps it blend on much easier. And just like the previous project, you can see that I have that Durham's water putty on there where I filled in the holes from where I removed the hanger that was on the back. I do an extra coat around that edge because I want to distress that and have it come back down to the black. For the feet on this one, I'm using these large barrel spools that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I'm going to go ahead and give all of them a coat of that white chalk paint. This is the same chalk paint mixture that I did on the first project. I'm going to give this 2 coats on the top and sides. So now I want to use IOD's Rural Scene stamp set. I absolutely love these. They are so pretty. And I haven't used them before, so I'm going to go ahead and prep these by using some fine grit sandpaper, going one direction and then the other. I'm trying out these on a piece of paper first because I didn't know how much ink I wanted on these. I wanted it to be slightly faded and distressed. So I kind of had to play around with it and get a feel for how much ink I needed on my stamp. I did this process with each of the elements that I wanted to use. Placed the larger stamp onto my board, and then I picked it up with my stamp mount and then inked it up. And I wondered if this was going to work because there's a slight lip around the edge of that box. But when I laid it down, I felt like I was getting good contact, so I thought it was going to work okay, but it did not. So I ended up having to just take the stamp off and carefully replace it back on there. The mistake I made is I should have added more ink because I lined this up very carefully and re-stamped it, but there wasn't enough ink on there to make a difference. So I had to pull it off and re-ink it and then go over it once again, hoping that I didn't mess it up and get a blurred image. I had to keep checking to make sure I was getting the coverage that I wanted and putting it back down and pressing a little more on the areas that weren't quite dark enough. And then I moved on to the next piece that's going to be forward in this scenery, which is this tree, which the center section there did not fill in. So I went in with a little more ink using my sponge dauber to apply it, and then tried to fix that little missing piece. And then I wanted to add a little bit more to the top of that tree, so I did the same thing, and it actually turned out a little bit darker than I would have liked, but I go back in later and sand that down a little bit. So now I'm using the masks to cover the tree, and I'm using some painter's tape on the edge of that because I don't want this one to bleed onto the edge. This is one of those like little ground cover pieces, and I want that to be behind the tree, so that's why I put the mask on the tree. And then I will also have to mask up the main piece to do some more ground cover so that it doesn't bleed over onto the top of that piece either. So that way all the pieces that are forward you want to mask so that everything else goes behind it. And then I'm going to add this little tree on there, and that will complete this scene. I'm using IOD's Adornment Stamp to go around the perimeter of my riser. And again, I'm just prepping it because it's brand new. I'm using Stays on Ink in the color Jet Black. This is the color I used on the front of the riser as well. And I'm noticing some issues when I stamp this up. Again, I'm trying these out first. And the bottom part just isn't filling in as much with the ink. But I kind of like this whole distressed look that it's giving me. So I'm just going to go with it and put these on here. I can always go in and sand back some of the areas that are darker, but I really had to load this stamp up with a lot of ink. And I don't know, if it's the preparation I did wasn't quite right or what, but I end up really liking how it turns out because it has a naturally distressed look to it, and that's what I wanted anyway. So I'm just going to line this up kind of in the center here and press it down. And the way these stamps are made is they line up perfectly end to end, like they interlock. So it just worked out really well to be able to run this all the way around and, have it look like it all goes together. I used the Gorilla Super Glue Gel on these little feet as well, but I had no issues with it on these. They stuck just fine. So now it's time to go ahead and touch up that bottom rim with my white chalk paint. And once that's dry, I can go ahead and touch up that middle section with the black chalk paint. It's time to distress, so I'm using some fine grit sandpaper to rub over any of the very dark inked spots, just to kind of bring everything together and make it look a little more distressed on the same level. I'm doing it on the top and on the sides, and then I'm going in around those little edges on the outside of that raised area, and then I will do the inside of that area as well, just to give a little distressing around the edges of this little riser. I'm sealing this with a clear wax, just brushing it on over the entire piece and then wiping it back. The finishing touch is just a little bit of that black wax into the grooves around the little barrel feet. And then I'm also going to brush some of that onto that bottom edge of the riser right there. And just wipe all that back. And that's it for this one. I love how simple and primitive this turned out. I think it's absolutely adorable. Onto our third and final riser tray. I am removing all these stickers with the aid of my heat gun and a little scraper. These boards tend to have some really rough edges, so I went ahead and gave it a good sanding, and I'm just going in with a couple of coats of my white chalk paint. And yes, this is the same chalk paint that I mixed up for the other two projects. I've got these little round ball knobs that I'm going to go ahead and give a coat of that same chalk paint. These will be the feet. I'm going to try my first paint inlay on this project. This is the Melange paint inlay from IOD. It's actually an older one and not a new release. And I love this image here that I'm cutting out. I thought it would be just perfect. And I had my share of problems here, so be sure to watch. I managed to fix it all, but I'm going to put that little text saying just off to the side instead of underneath. So I'm putting my coat of the white chalk paint, and I'm just painting in that area in the center where I'm going to lay this inlay down. I forgot to mist the inlay before I laid it down. I think that might have contributed to one of my problems. So I go ahead and get that down and then put the little wording down, and then I mist this like you're supposed to, and I'm trying to, you know, press down, get all that moisture in there. I'm using my brayer, and what I noticed was some of the pieces weren't adhering, so I knew that I was going to have a problem when I went to remove it. So after it had completely dried, I went ahead and misted it, and I start peeling it back, and sure enough, I have all these areas where I didn't get any of the transfer happening there. So now I need to figure out how to fix this. Even the text was like kind of blurred, and it was just strange. So I had a couple of options here. I could paint over the whole thing again and reapply this, but because it had pulled up some of that paint onto that transfer, I decided to just go ahead and cut out. And I know all of you are going to lose your minds over, now you can't reuse this transfer, but under the circumstances, I felt like this was my best option. I'm cutting out the pieces that didn't transfer well, and I'm going to reapply them with polyacrylic over those areas. So I go ahead and brush that on that area. I wet the paint inlay this time to reapply it, and then because I didn't want to spray all over this entire board and reactivate the previous ones, I just dabbed them with a wet towel to get them to adhere down. This was a little bit difficult because I couldn't completely see through those inlays unless they were wet, but I, you know, just did the best I could. And when I went to release them, it was working. But that one, it needed another piece that I hadn't put down. I cut it too short, so I had to redo it. But all of these ended up coming out just fine. And this is where I'm adding in that extra piece where I had cut it too short. So I just had a few spots like that I had to fix again, doing the same procedure with the polyacrylic, putting that down there, letting it dry, then getting it wet again and removing it. And this fix actually ended up working really well, but that paint inlay is, you know, now it's cut up into pieces, so I probably won't be able to use the whole piece again, but I can use bits and pieces of it. Now with all the fixes done, I'm going to go ahead and give it a light spritz of my matte clear sealer. Okay, so I'm interrupting this normal voiceover. This needs to be explained in real time. I can see a border of where I put this paint inlay on, and I'm not sure what caused that. I'm going to try and show you what I mean. If I point this towards my light, see how all this in here is whiter than the rest of it. Like right here, this is all whiter than out here. And I thought I saw this when I first took the inlay off, but I don't know. I guess I just thought it would end up blending in once everything, you know, was sealed. But in natural light, that really shows up, and I don't like it. So I still have some of the paint that I used. It's kind of, I've watered it down a little bit. It's still kind of gloppy and clumpy, but I'm going to attempt to paint some of that in all these little areas to make it less obvious that there's like this border of where the paint inlay went on. So if you're experienced with using these paint inlays and can tell me what I did wrong that caused that, I'd greatly appreciate it. This is my first go, and I'm definitely learning a lot. But I absolutely love these designs, so I'm not going to give up on these. I'm going to keep using them. So I'm going to once again try to do a little fixed job on this, and we'll see how it goes. So I am just taking that original paint and I am blending around all the edges of the flowers and the leaves, trying to bring that original color back into the center and blending it out back into the edges of the board so that I can remove as much of that bordered look that I got as I can from this and make it all blend a little more seamlessly. It's looking much better, so now I'm going to do a coat of my polyacrylic across the entire piece. So I got these little handles from the Restore Habitat for Humanity. Thought they were perfect. They're the perfect color. And I laid them on a piece of painter's tape to mark the holes with a sharp pencil so that I could lay that tape onto the board to mark the holes. And even though I measured and measured and measured to make sure these were centered, the holes were in the right spot, they still did not line up right. And when I went to screw them in, I had to take it back out to the garage and re-drill the hole to move it over a little bit. It's happened on both sides, so I apparently made the mistake twice, and I'm not sure what that mistake was with all the measuring I did. But eventually, you know, I got them all screwed in, and they look great. So now we're going to attach those little feet. I'm using E6000 on this one. You could probably use the wood glue, but I did not want to try the super glue again after the failure I had. So E6000 it is. And now I'm painting in those little areas where the wood kind of chipped away when I drilled through. I'm using my Jolie clear finishing wax around the little feet so that I can go in and apply some black wax as well. So here I'm brushing on the black wax and I will wipe that back. I'm going to do this to all 4 of the feet, and then I'm going to do the same procedure to the edge of the riser. Brushing on the clear wax, wiping it back, and then going in with my black wax, brushing that on and wiping that back. And that will be it for this little project. We are at the end and we can take a look at how everything turned out. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you for coming back to my channel if you're a repeat viewer. If you're new here, I hope you find my content useful and will come back for more. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope I've inspired you to go create something. See you next time.